The royal road ended abruptly at the border of the eastern wastes, as if civilization itself had decided to retreat from what lay beyond. Sylvar Rosser stood at this final threshold of his former kingdom, the weight of 3,000 years settling heavily upon his shoulders. Behind him lay the last outpost of Elver's authority, a weathered watchtower whose crystal-weaved spires were dulled with age, its high elven guards deliberately averting their ancient eyes as one of their own passed into exile. Never in the recorded history of House Rosser had one of their princes faced such a fate. His silver-gilt hair, characteristic of the high elven nobility, caught what little light remained in this forsaken place. The corruption that plagued these lands was an affront to everything his people had spent millennia protecting. The ground wept with an iridescent ichor that pooled in depressions and carved new rivulets through soil that seemed to pulse with unnatural life. Vegetation, if it could still be called such, had adapted to this tainted sustenance in ways that defied the natural laws documented in the crystal libraries of Astralin. "Well, old friend," Sylvar murmured to his mount, a magnificent destrier bred in the crystal spires and enhanced with ancient magics, "it seems our paths lead where few of our kind have tread." The horse's ears flicked back nervously, its enhanced senses detecting the wrongness that permeated the air. Even the wind here felt tainted, too thick, too living, as if each breath might carry something malevolent into lungs accustomed to the pure air of the crystal spires. His hand fell to the pommel of his ancestral sword, the blade of House Rosser, folded with traces of silverite and enchanted with powers that made it gleam like captured moonlight. The weapon had been carried by generations of Rosser princes, its edge as keen now as when it was first forged in the First Age. Now, as he faced the wasteland before him, Sylvar found himself hoping the old tales of its power against darkness held more truth than mere poetry. The memories of his trial rose unbidden, sharp as shattered crystal. Prince Sylvar Rosser, Lord High Justice Thornhaven's voice had carried through the great hall's crystal-weave architecture like a death knell. "You stand accused of high treason against the crown and people of Elver." The forged letters, damning in their careful craftsmanship. Lord Blackthorn's satisfied smirk as each piece of fabricated evidence was presented, his eyes holding the cold calculation of one who had spent centuries perfecting this betrayal. Lady Frost's winter-cold gaze watching his every reaction, seeking signs of weakness in one who had walked the world since the Age of Discovery. And Elena, dear Elena, watching from the gallery with tears streaming down her face, knowing the truth but powerless to stop what was coming. 300 years they had known each other, a brief friendship by high elven standards, but no less precious for its relative youth. Sylvar's grip tightened on the reins, the leather creaking in protest. The conspirators had been clever, he had to give them that. The forged correspondence had been masterfully crafted, playing perfectly into the council's paranoid fears about his proposed reforms. Peace with the barbarian kingdoms? Equal rights for the lower races? Much easier to brand him a traitor than face the possibility of change, especially from a prince of House Rosser who was expected to maintain traditions, not challenge them. By midday, the corruption had claimed his first water skin. Sylvar discovered it when he reached for a drink. The leather had turned black where the iridescent soil had splashed against it, the water within now showing the same prismatic sheen as the pools they'd been avoiding. He cast the skin aside, watching as it seemed to dissolve where it landed, the corruption spreading through it like ink through parchment. The sight of his supplies being so easily tainted forced him to take proper stock of what remained. 2 more water skins, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth. Provisions for a week, though who knew if they would remain edible in this environment. His armor and weapons, the plate mail he'd worn since before most humans were born, and of course, the Rosser blade at his hip. A few basic tools, some coin that would likely be worthless out here, and the clothes on his back. Not exactly how our ancestors crossed the Twilight Sea, is it? He murmured to his mount, remembering the grand tales of the High Elves' early explorations. Those pioneers had carried artifacts of power, gone forth in great companies with proper provisions and planning. He had been given 6 hours to gather what he could and leave the city. The memory of those frantic preparations cut through him. Elena rushing into his chambers as he hurriedly packed, her face flushed from running through the palace corridors. "Take this," she'd said, pressing a small crystal into his hand. "It's tuned to my personal frequency." If, when you find somewhere safe, use it. Let me know you survive. He tried to refuse possession of such communication crystals by an exile was strictly forbidden. But she'd closed his fingers around it, her touch lingering. They can take your titles, your position, even your home. But they cannot take 300 years of friendship. The crystal now rested in an inner pocket, carefully wrapped to protect it from the corruption. He wasn't sure if it would even function in the wastes, but its presence offered a small comfort, a reminder that not everyone in Astral End believed the lies. A sudden shift in the wind broke his reverie. The air grew heavier, carrying a metallic tang that made his mount snort nervously. Ahead, the twisted landscape disappeared into banks of low-lying mist that seemed to eat what little light remained. The vapor moved against the wind, coiling like living smoke. Sylvar drew the Rosser blade, its familiar weight offering little comfort as the mist began to take on shapes suggesting forms that should not exist in any sane world. The sword's enchantments, meant to illuminate darkness, instead seemed to draw the shadows closer. A sound cut through his bitter reflections, something between a howl and a scream, distant but carrying clearly in the dead air. His mount's ears flattened against its skull, muscles trembling beneath him. Whatever had made that sound, it was an affront to the natural order his people had spent millennia preserving. Easy, he soothed, though his own heart had begun to race. We've faced worse than wasteland predators. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. In truth, nothing in his centuries of warfare had prepared him for what lay ahead. A Rosser blade was meant to be wielded with honor, its enchantments channeling ancient magics passed down through generations. But here, in this place of corruption, would such powers even answer his call? The sun hung low on the horizon, though whether it was rising or setting was impossible to tell through the perpetual haze that shrouded the wastes. Its light seemed to bend wrongly here, creating shadows that moved in ways that defied natural law. Sylvar found his eyes drawn to these aberrant patches of darkness, watching as they flowed against the wind like liquid night. The first time it happened, he dismissed it as a trick of light against eyes accustomed to the clean radiance of Astral End. By the third time, he was sure something was fundamentally wrong. The shadows seemed to reach for him, not with malevolence but with curiosity. His sword hand tingled, and when he looked down, he saw dark patterns etching themselves into his skin like frost spreading across a winter pond before fading away. Best find shelter before true night falls, he muttered, urging his mount forward. The border guards had warned him, at least, of that much. Night in the wastes brought horrors that even the corrupted beasts feared. He guided his horse carefully around pools of iridescent corruption, his trained senses detecting wrongness that went beyond mere physical taint. The liquid seemed to follow their movement with an intelligence that made his ancient soul recoil. The ground was treacherous, what looked like solid earth could give way to pockets of corrupted soil that bubbled with noxious gases. More than once, he had to backtrack when the path ahead proved impassable, forcing them closer to twisted copses of trees that seemed to reach for them with branch claws that dripped unknown substances. As the day wore on, the shadows grew longer, deeper, more substantial somehow. The corruption that tainted the land seemed to gather in these dark patches, making them move in ways that defied the natural laws his people had spent millennia cataloging. Sylvar found himself drawing the Rosser blade, taking comfort in its familiar weight and the way its silverite elements caught what little light remained. But the weapon felt different here. The metal hummed with a resonance he'd never encountered in 3,000 years of wielding it. When he swung it experimentally, the sword left trails of shadow in its wake, darkness clinging to its enchanted edge like reluctant lovers. Night fell with the suddenness of an executioner's blade. One moment, the wan sun still hung above the horizon, the next, darkness crashed over the land like a tide. Sylvar had barely guided his mount into the shelter of a rock outcropping when the temperature plummeted. His breath frosted in the air, forming crystals that caught the light of corrupted flora with prismatic effects that seemed to mock the pure crystalline spires of his homeland. That was when the shadows began to move with purpose. The darkness around him seemed to congeal, becoming almost tangible. It pressed against his skin like cold silk, leaving marks that didn't fade, patterns of absolute black that began to trace themselves across his flesh. His sword, propped against the rock beside him, resonated with a new frequency that made the air itself vibrate in sympathy. When he grasped the hilt, the blade seemed to drink in what little light remained, leaving trails of solid shadow in the air when he moved it. The silverite inlays had taken on a darker sheen, as if the metal itself was being transformed by whatever power had taken hold of him. "Well," he said to the empty air, his ancient voice holding a trace of its old wry humor, "it seems even the oldest laws can be broken." His mount nickered softly in response, pressing closer to the rock wall as something vast moved through the darkness beyond their shelter. Sylvar tightened his grip on the shadow-touched blade, watching as patterns of pure darkness continued to etch themselves into his flesh like terrible runes. The wastes had marked him now. Changed him. And this, he somehow knew, was only the beginning. For the first time in his 3,000 years, Sylvar faced a transformation that all his heritage and ancient knowledge had not prepared him for. The real test would come with dawn, if dawn still held meaning in this place where shadows had substance and corruption reshaped all it touched. For now, though, he could only wait, feeling the shadow's touch spread across his skin and wondering what price he would ultimately pay for the power being offered. The power he knew, with growing certainty, he would need to survive in this place where even darkness had will and purpose of its own. A deep rumble shook the scaled ground beneath them. At first, Sylvar thought it was merely another tremor in this unstable land until he saw the patterns. The massive scales weren't random, they formed concentric circles around a central point. As the rumbling grew stronger, that point began to split apart, revealing not an eye as he'd first feared, but something far worse. What rose from beneath the ground was an abomination, a massive writhing tentacles surrounding a maw lined with crystalline teeth that gleamed with unholy light. The creature's flesh pulsed with corrupt energy, each beat sending waves of darkness across its surface. The air itself seemed to recoil from its presence, growing thick with the stench of ancient evil. "Valkyr," Sylvar whispered, recognizing the demon's form from texts in House Rosser's forbidden archives. The demon prince of transformation, cast out of the lower hells for being too corrupt even for that realm. "Your kind remembers me, little elf." The voice crashed through his mind like broken glass, bringing with it visions of horror and corruption that would have driven a lesser being mad. But 3,000 years of high elven discipline held firm, his mind remained his own, even as his flesh began to crawl with reaction to the demon's presence. His mount wasn't so fortunate. The horse screamed, a sound of pure anguish as corruption began to spread across its flesh. Crystal growths erupted from its hide, each pulse of the demon's power accelerating the transformation. "No!" Sylvar reached for his steed, but the corruption spread faster. The horse's eyes began to crystallize, its proud form twisting as the demon's power reshaped it. Yet still it fought, still it trusted him even as its body betrayed it. It turned its head to press against his hand one final time. Such loyalty, the demon mocked. Such weakness. Sylvar felt the changes trying to take hold in his own flesh, dark patterns spreading across his skin, shadows writhing beneath the surface. But where his mount's mind had been vulnerable to the corruption, his thoughts remained clear. The pain was extraordinary, yet his will remained unbroken. "You cannot have me," he snarled, raising the Rosser blade. The sword's ancient enchantments flared against the darkness, though the metal itself had begun to change, drinking in shadow rather than reflecting light. "Brave words. But I already have part of you." His mount collapsed, its transformation nearly complete. The proud destrier that had served House Rosser for centuries was almost unrecognizable now, its form a twisted mass of crystal and corrupt flesh. Yet its eyes, in their final moments before the crystal claimed them completely, still held recognition. Still held trust. Sylvar knew what he had to do. The blade of House Rosser had always been used with honor, had always stood against corruption. Now it would grant mercy. "Forgive me, old friend," he whispered, and brought the sword down in one clean stroke. The horse's corrupted form shattered like glass, fragments of crystal and flesh dissolving into shadow. For a moment, Sylvar thought he saw its spirit rise pure and untainted before fading away. "First blood," the demon laughed. "But not last. You resist my mind, little elf, but your flesh. Your flesh remembers older things than elven pride. The corruption surged around him, tentacles of pure darkness rising from the ground. Sylvar fought with 3 millennia of skill, the Rosser blade leaving trails of solid shadow in its wake. Each cut drove the darkness back, but more rose to replace it. And with each strike, each contact with the corrupt power, the patterns on his skin grew more pronounced. He fought until his arms burned, until the ground ran black with corrupt ichor, until finally an opening appeared in the demon's defenses. Without hesitation, Sylvar charged through it, though the passage left more shadows writhing beneath his skin. Running already? The demon's laughter shook the ground. Take my gift with you, Prince of Elver. Let it remind you that all things change. All things corrupt. All things end. Sylvar ran until the laughter faded, until the scaled ground gave way to more normal terrain, though normal in the wastes was relative. When he finally stopped, he examined his changed flesh. The patterns of darkness had spread further, more complex now, forming designs that seemed to hold meaning just beyond comprehension. His sword, when he studied it, had transformed as well. The silverite inlays had darkened completely, and shadows clung to the blade like reluctant lovers. Yet it still felt right in his hand, changed, yes, but not corrupted. Transformed, but still true to its purpose. He looked back the way he'd come, remembering his mount's final moments of trust. The loss cut deeper than any physical pain, but it also hardened his resolve. He was changing, yes, but his mind remained his own. His will remained unbroken. The shadows might mark his flesh, might change his form, but they would never claim his soul.